Hi, good day each and everyone. We are the Group 7 and today we are going to tackle about arts in Asia, particularly the Chinese art, the Japanese art, and the Philippine art. But before we tackle about the topic, art is a very broad word. There are different types and different kinds of art. So we are only going to tackle about the painting, the sculpture, and the architecture. So uh, without further ado, let's go to the topic. First would be the Chinese art, the Chinese painting. So, traditional Chinese painting involves essentially the same techniques as Chinese calligraphy and is done with a brush dipped in black or colored ink. So, in Chinese painting, there are two main techniques, namely the gongbi and the ink and wash painting. So, the gongbi is also known as the meticulous technique, while the ink and wash painting or technique is also known as the freehand technique. So, an example for Chinese painting would be the Eight Views of Xiaoxiang by Li Shi. So, that would be all for the Chinese painting. Now, let's talk about the Chinese sculpture. So, as we all know, a huge part of China or a huge part of Chinese are Buddhists. So, Buddhism is a huge context of all large portrait sculpture. One very good example of Chinese sculpture would be the Lishan Giant Buddha. So that will be all for the Chinese sculpture. Now let's tackle about the Chinese architecture. So the structural principles of Chinese architecture have remained largely unchanged throughout the history. So the main changes being only the decorative details. So one example or a one very good example of Chinese architecture would be the Great Wall of China. So that would be all for the Chinese art. Now let's tackle about the Japanese art. First would be the Japanese painting. So painting is the preferred artistic expression in Japan, practiced by amateurs and professionals alike. Until modern times, the Japanese wrote with a brush rather than a pen, and their familiarity with brush techniques has made them particularly sensitive to the values and aesthetics of painting. So, the example of Japanese painting would be The Great Wave of Kanagawa by Katsushika Hokusai. So that would be all for the Japanese painting. Now let's tackle about the Japanese sculpture. So same with China, the Japan or the Japanese, a huge part of Japan or Japanese are Buddhists. So Buddhism is also a huge context of all portrait sculpture in Japanese culture. So, one example of Japanese sculpture would be the Shakyamuni Triad in Horyuji by Toribushi. So, that would be all for the Japanese sculpture. Now, let's tackle about the Japanese architecture. So, the Japanese architecture has been typified by wooden structures elevated slightly off the ground with tiled or thatched roofs. So, the example of Japanese architecture would be the Kinkakuji in Kyoto, originally built in 1397. So that will be all for the Chinese art and the Japanese art. Now let's go to the last type of Asian art would be the Philippine art. So first would be the Philippine painting. So Philippine art in painting was greatly influenced by other Asian and Western culture, since Philippine has been colonized many times. So our art in painting was greatly influenced by them. So the example of Philippine painting would be the Spoliarium by Juan Luna. Now let's tackle about the Philippine sculpture. So Philippine sculpture is commonly used to commemorate heroes and saints. Example of this would be the Rizal Monument on 1913, a national cultural treasure. Now let's tackle about the Philippine architecture. So, Filipino architecture is influenced by the folk architecture of its ethnic groups, including the Bahay Kubo, the Bahay na Bato, Torogan, Ijang, Payo, and shrines and mosque. So one example of Philippine architecture would be the Intramuros in Manila. So that will be all for the arts in Asia, particularly in Chinese art, Japanese art, and Philippine art. Thank you for watching.